Hello everyone, welcome back to the Zach F1 channel, and in today's episode we are going over everything that you need to know for F1 Fantasy post FP2 because there's a lot to get through. Of course, like always, I'll be live an hour and 15 minutes before qualifying. For me, that'll be 4:45 in the morning. It could be plenty of times. Big shout out to my Aussie and New Zealand fans because I believe your time schedules are like the best. Correct me if I'm wrong. But anyway, like always, like and subscribe. Remember the fantasy survey if you want to do that as well. Get your thoughts down for what F1 need to change for F1 Fantasy. But anyway, let's do a very quick summary of what you need to know. So, off the bat, straight away, Mercedes look quick. Now, does that mean you bring them in or not? I'll get to that in a second. But let's say you do believe that the Mercedes pace will hold on to the race. They are cheaper than the Ferrari and the McLaren assets, so it does look quite enticing. Now, if you were to go for this Mercedes build, it'd most likely be paired with the all-round most balanced car this weekend, which looks like the McLaren, especially with Lando Norris. So you'd probably have McLaren and Mercedes with Norris and Hamilton, and if you couldn't afford that, Norris and Russell. However, you just need to be careful because their race pace is being shown as to be pretty abysmal behind Red Bull, Ferrari and McLaren. So it really is going to be, can they hold out from what they've done in qualifying? Because it looked like they had quite a bit of quali pace, but we've seen it before where Mercedes look good in practice and then they don't really perform as much as they did in the race. However, we've also seen where it's worked out. This could be very similar to the Canada incident. I'm not talking about that Canada incident, but the F1 Fantasy Canada incident. And I just think it's one of those weekends where I'm going to flip-flopping my mind from Mercedes or Ferrari throughout the whole weekend. So keep that in mind. But in my opinion, for now, I'm going to be sticking with Ferrari because they seem like the safer option. And McLaren anyway look like the better choice. So at least I know where my 2 times is going. But anyway, like I mentioned, McLaren look like the next best. Good on qualifying pace and on the race pace compared to the Ferraris, Mercedes and Red Bulls. Now, if you bring them in, you're probably going to pair them with a Mercedes or Ferrari. For now, I'm more leaning towards the Ferrari. And these teams would consist of most likely McLaren, Ferrari, then Norris, then Leclerc. Now, I say Leclerc because I'm a little bit worried about Piastri. He's looked kind of off it this whole weekend. So if there's one driver to avoid on the big teams, I actually think it's both Sainz and Piastri. If you really want to go for a big team with McLaren and Ferrari, it's got to have Norris and Leclerc. If you want to go for the differential, it's McLaren and Mercedes this weekend. Now, one big thing you need to know before changing your teams all about is be careful how your team looks this weekend going into next weekend as well, because Qatar is a sprint race. Now, I don't think you really need free transfers going into Qatar, especially if you've got extra DRS or limitless. However, if you change your team too much, let's say you go for the Mercedes assets, then you've got to faff about getting rid of them for Qatar, because most likely Mercedes will be off the pace. If they do have pace in Vegas, I doubt it will then be in Qatar again, because we've seen Mercedes are very on and off with their pace. So that means you've got to be careful with which cheap drivers you choose as well. So if you use free transfers this weekend and you change a cheap driver as well, and all of a sudden you can't get back that Ferrari with McLaren and Norris and Leclerc build for the 3 times autopilot, whatever chip you're using in Qatar, that is a little bit of a worry. So be careful when it comes to the cheap drivers. However, cheap driver wise, as suspected, Hulkenberg looks very good. Haas in general look amazing. Hulkenberg, if you can bring him in. It's as simple as that. He looks like he's definitely getting a top 8 this weekend. However, a driver who did look good in practice too is Pierre Gasly. Be careful of them. We've seen Alpine do this before where they qualify well and they do have worse race pace than other drivers. So I would steer clear purely because I just don't see it happening for Alpine this weekend. Then we have Colapinto. The issue with Colapinto and Williams as a whole is that Colapinto is so cheap, I don't think it matters, even with all of the Williams risks. Now, remember, constructors, you want the biggest constructors, so it would only be between McLaren, Ferrari, and Mercedes this weekend. Red Bull look nowhere at the minute, so you don't want to get cheap constructors anyway, but staying clear of Williams. And then their assets, I think between Albon and Zhou, it's looking like Zhou is the one to go for. He's the safe option, and for most people, it is Albon versus Zhou for what they can afford. I'm probably going to be using Zhou if I can use my 2 free transfers to get there and I don't faff about with the Mercedes. And also just because there's too much of a risk now with those massive negative points you can get from DNFs. bringing in Albon. We've seen him do it so many times this season, and we've seen Williams just let us down so many times throughout the season as well. So, Colapinto, a bit of an issue, but just classify him as a bit of a dud driver because you need him to bring in the better premium drivers that get your team more points overall. Then remember, Valtteri Bottas does have a grid penalty coming into the race, so he'll most likely start at the back of the grid. So out of Zhou or Bottas, this weekend I'm going Bottas, because if he starts at the back, he'll probably overtake Zhou and he'll actually get a few points. So I'm actually looking forward to actually having Bottas in my team for once. So I'd recommend double Sauber is the way to go if you can't afford it. If you can afford anything else, Bottas, Hulkenberg, those are the sorts of teams you'd be looking at. And then finally, driver and constructors wise, like I mentioned, Red Bull is a big steer clear. Them as a constructor and their assets do not look good. Apparently they've cocked up something with their rear wing, so we'll see how they try to fix that. But right now it's looking like they're completely out of the picture. No doubt in my mind Verstappen still gets a top 6, even when Checo's right at the back of the grid. However, F1 Fantasy wise, they are a no-go. Now, chips wise, it hasn't changed. I still wouldn't use any chips here. We haven't seen any craziness enough for me to go, keep an eye on your final fix or keep an eye on a wild card. So I still wouldn't use any chips here. And then just one more caution again to think ahead of your teams for Qatar, because I know it's a little bit annoying to do this, but Vegas is so much less important than the final sprint race because you can get so much more points from sprint race weekends. We saw it in Brazil, we saw it in Qatar. If you get your drivers right, you can score a lot of points. So be careful when picking your teams that it doesn't screw you over for Qatar. But anyway, thank you all so much for watching. Remember, I will be live at 4:45, an hour and 15 minutes before qualifying, to go over everything again and to go over any queries you have with your teams. Remember the F1 Fantasy survey, I'll link it down below, link in the description and in the comments. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all later. Well, I'll see you all in about 7-8 hours by the time I put this up. Thank you all for watching. Take care.